Let's dig a little bit deeper right now in the U.S. war on ISIS, the mistakes that were made. Our Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr is joining us, along with our military analyst, retired U.S. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and David Ignatius, the Washington Post columnist and associate editor. You had a big column, David. You spoke with the director of national intelligence. He acknowledged mistakes were made. How surprising was this to you?
Well, I thought he was being frank. I put to him the question of the performance of U.S. intelligence in assessing the emergence of ISIS. He said we saw them growing. He said we saw the difficulties in the Iraqi army. And then he said the thing that we underestimated was the will of this adversary, and overestimated was the will of the Iraqi army. It was striking in part because Clapper is a longtime intelligence professional. He looked back to Vietnam and said the United States had made the same mistake then in overestimating our ally, underestimating our adversary.
I assume that's why months ago, back in January, when the president was asked about ISIS and these various splinter terrorist groups in that New Yorker magazine interview, he spoke about junior varsity, JVs. Was that based on bad intelligence? He gets a daily intelligence briefing that he was receiving?
Clearly, the intelligence agencies were not ringing the bell. If the president could say that and not be contradicted, that was a sign of people not taking this seriously enough. I think what Clapper was focusing on, Wolf, was the most important and mysterious factor in warfare, which is will. Do we have the will to prevail against ISIS? ISIS clearly is demonstrating the will to fight the U.S. and its allies hard.
And Barbara Starr, you're over at the Pentagon. The other major blunder was overestimating what this Iraqi military would do in the face of this ISIS threat. ISIS, bunch of guys, they came into Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, nearly 2 million people. And the Iraqi military, despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that the U.S. has spent training them, arming them, providing them with weapons, et cetera, they just ran away.
Well, you know, it could really, a lot of military people in the Pentagon will tell you it really goes back to 2011 when the U.S. military left. The Iraqi government at the time didn't want the U.S. to stay. There was no agreement for the U.S. to stay. And I think, again, we're talking 2020 hindsight. As you look back, were the Iraqis really ready? Militarily, perhaps not, but more importantly, more significantly, politically not. The Maliki government was not ever able, not ever willing to have an inclusive government and an inclusive military. And it really, many people will tell you, sowed the seeds for what has happened now in the intervening years. Predictable at the time, no. Understandable as you look back.
When you look back at General Hertling, you spent a lot of time in Iraq. Would it really have made much of a difference if the U.S. had retained, let's say, 2,000 or even 5,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, if the Iraqi regime of Nouri al-Maliki would have given, under a status of forces agreement, those U.S. troops immunity?
Yeah, I think it's irrelevant, Wolf, because we didn't. But the point is, I'll push back a little bit about the Iraqi army running away. It was becoming a good army during the period between 2007 and 2011. There was a lot of pushes toward increasing their strength, having them do operations on their own, and they were becoming good. Not great, but good. And I think as soon as the U.S. left, Mr. Maliki had his will, started replacing leaders, and when you don't have leaders in an army, that army is going to fall apart. That army didn't run away. I think in many cases, the tribal sheikhs in the area said, the government isn't supporting us. Why are we fighting for the central government in Baghdad? And I think they probably just walked away from their post as opposed to run away from ISIS.
You know, David, you spent a lot of time in Iraq. I was there as well. You know, a lot of those military commanders who weren't Shiites, like Nouri al-Maliki, but Sunnis, as soon as the pressure came in, they didn't trust the Shiites. They ran away, and many of them not only ran away, they defected to ISIS. And yes, ISIS has a significant army right now with a lot of trained Iraqi officers.
I think that's one key to ISIS's success on the battlefield, is it's taken on these Sunni majors, lieutenant colonels from the Republican Guard, from Saddam's forces, and that's really made them much more potent. I'm really struck, Wolf, as I hear General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, listen to General Odierno, the Army Chief of Staff, General Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the way in which the military and our national security officials are pushing back at the White House, in effect, saying if we're getting into this conflict, we need to be more honest with ourselves about our allies, about our adversaries. I just see more pushback, especially by comparison to 2003 in Iraq.
We heard the Pentagon spokesman, General Hertling, tell us just in the last hour there is no serious division or split or rift between the generals and the President of the United States. You believe that?
I do, Wolf, and I also think it's a great point about the pushback. The names that were just mentioned, Odierno, Dempsey, Austin, myself, we were the ones that spent a lot of time there. I think we understand the culture when you live with the people several years, and we understand that just going in and inadvertently bombing places isn't going to work. You really have to have the Iraqi culture take over on this. I mean, the expression of winning their hearts and minds is inconclusive. What you have to do is win trust and confidence, and that can only be won when the forces on the ground belong to the culture.
Were you surprised, Barbara, that General Mattis, who served as the commander of the Central Command under President Obama, was so blunt in saying these are half-hearted efforts that can backfire?
No, General Mattis has always been one of the most candid, and I think General Hertling is going to wind up agreeing with me. Mattis has always been one of the most candid senior officers in the U.S. military. While he was in uniform, of course, he had to be very careful and could not publicly speak against anything that was U.S. policy or the commander-in-chief. Now, like all retired generals, he has more leeway to do it. Is there a difference in opinion, in strategy? I don't think so. I think the administration and the generals, the commanders, have the same goals, the same strategy. I think what you are seeing is that pushback. 13 years later, don't sugarcoat it. Get out there, say what exactly is going on, what the problems are going to be, and explain to the American people the price to be paid before some of these decisions are made. I am totally convinced that that is where the General Officer Corps is right now. They want to see honesty with the American people.
Well said. Barbara Starr at the Pentagon. General Hertling, thanks to you. David Ignatius, always good.